could we be given warning at the beginning of a programme if there's going to be anything about the Beatles, as all Beatle fans can make sure to listen, and have a chance to ring up other fans to make sure they are also listening.
Hi everybody, this is John here.
This is Paul.
George.
And Ringo.
And we're very happy to be on your programme once again.
Welcome to Beatles News Briefs number 108. I'm your host, Steve Marinucci, and thanks for joining us today. This is the second of our two shows on the documentary Borrowed Time, Lennon's Last Decade. Our guest is 8-time Emmy winner Alan Weiss, who has a featured interview in Borrowed Time and was working as a news producer for the local WABC-TV affiliate in New York City on December 8, 1980, the night John Lennon was killed. Through an amazing sequence of events, he became the source for the first news report of the tragedy. We'll talk about how he came to report one of the biggest stories of 1980. But our discussion here also looks at a different angle. What has always fascinated me as a journalist about his story was how the story that even he wasn't sure of at first made its way past editors, first at the local affiliate and then up to the network, where Howard Cosell, who eventually announced the tragic news to his Monday Night Football audience, was initially very hesitant and had to be persuaded to report the breaking news to fans by a colleague. So let's get started. I'm pleased to welcome Mr. Alan Weiss, who is a 8-time Emmy Award-winning executive producer, director, and writer, formerly of WABC-TV's Channel 7 Eyewitness News, and he's now president of Alan Weiss Productions. He was the journalist who was the source for the story of John Lennon's death on December 8th that Howard Cosell announced on Monday Night Football, and he won a New York area Emmy Award for Outstanding Spot News for the story at the 1980 Emmy Awards. This wasn't a simple phone call like you see in the movies, hey, City Desk. It took some real perseverance and maybe a little luck to get this story on the air. And Alan, I am thrilled to talk to you about this.
Well, I'm glad to be here, Steve.
Let's start at the beginning. You were leaving work that night on December 8th, 1980?
Yeah, actually, I had a date that night. On my way to pick her up, she was on the east side of Manhattan. ABC studios were on the west side of Manhattan. I had gone to an ATM. I had a motorcycle. I'd gone to an ATM, gotten some money out for the date, got back on my bike, and for some reason I didn't buckle my helmet, which was a big mistake.
And then what happened?
So I was driving through Central Park, and there are these 3 lanes in Central Park that are what's called Central Park South that go out of the park. And there's a 4th lane that continues to go through the park. And I was in one of the lanes that go out of the park. And a taxi was on my inside, so they also were supposed to go out of the park. But for some reason, the taxi driver decided at the very last second not to go out of the park, gunned his cab, and thought that there was enough space in front of me that he can cut in front of my motorcycle and cut to the other lane. Well, he mistimed it, and I ended up slamming into his taxi at 35 miles an hour, slammed onto his windshield, rolled over, his cab landed on the ground, hit my head really hard, and that's where not having buckled my helmet was a mistake, because the impact the first time was fine, but then I kind of bounced my head like a stone skipping across a pond 5 or 6 times without my helmet. So you can imagine by the time I came to a stop on that street on that cold night, my ears were ringing and my mind was quite a bit not in its normal collectively logical state as it should be.
You weren't knocked out. You were conscious.
I was conscious. I was so conscious that I'm lying there saying, wow, I'm okay. I'm not dead. And I looked up and I could see all these cars coming around the corner from the street that we just came from. And I'm in the park where there are no lights, basically. And I'm saying to myself, oh, I survived the car crash, das Boot, to then be run over by these cars that aren't going to see me lying in the road. But I was able to get out of the road in time, so I wasn't run over.
So you were taken to Roosevelt Hospital.
Yes.
What was your condition at that point? You had multiple bruises. You didn't have any broken bones, did you?
Didn't know. Say what you want to say about New Yorkers. I got to tell you that I'm lying there in Central Park and people came out of everywhere to talk to me and to keep me company. The cops were terrific. Then the EMTs came. They tried to pick me up and I screamed with agony when they lifted my leg. So we thought that I had broken my hip or my leg. They actually had to take the stretcher apart. They call it a scoop. They take it apart and they literally scoop underneath you. So they picked up me and a good part of Central Park, put me in the ambulance. And as they're taking me to Roosevelt, they said, "You're lucky it's not a weekend night." It was a Monday night because the ER is quiet and there's a young female doctor there who will take care of you. You'll be in great hands. So when I got to the ER and I was on a gurney and I'm in a hallway, they didn't put me into a room yet. I was just in a hallway and the doctor came over. I was filthy from having slid across the road as well as being picked up with part of Central Park. She started to examine me and could tell right away that there was something wrong with my hip and was about to send me to X-ray. What happened at that moment was she said, I can't tell how bad this is, Alan. We're going to need to have some X-rays done. I said, of course. And no sooner did she say that than the door behind my head and behind where she was standing slammed open and a man came running in screaming, "We have a gunshot in the chest." And the doctor says, "When's it coming in?" And he said, "Hit in the door right now." And the door slammed open again and these cops come running in carrying somebody between them. And they bring this person literally into the room I am lying outside of. And the doctor naturally said, "Alan, I'm going to have to postpone this for the moment. I got to go see what this is." And I said, "Of course, doc." So then I'm lying there. I got my eyes closed. My ears are ringing. My head is throbbing. My hip, I'm wondering how badly my hip is hurt. And two officers come out of having brought whoever it was in the room. And they literally are standing over my gurney. And one says to the other, "Can you believe it? John Lennon." And I opened my eyes and I looked up at them and I said, "Excuse me, sir, what did you say?" And they looked down at me and I got twigs, I got leaves, I've got dirt all over my clothes. I look like a homeless person. And they said, I didn't say anything, and they walked away. Well, think about it. You're lying on a bed in a hospital after being in a car crash, and you think you heard the words John Lennon. But could it possibly be John Lennon? Maybe it could be Jack Lemmon, still a story, but not of the same magnitude. Or maybe it's Jim Lennon, somebody who's a police officer. I wasn't sure, even if I hadn't banged my head, and I was fully compos mentis, I still wouldn't have been sure. Because A, they weren't talking to me, and it was just beyond the realm of credibility that I could be lying in a hospital, that John Lennon has a gunshot in his chest, and he's in the room 7 feet away from where I am. So I just didn't believe it. And I guess, gosh, I wish my journalism teachers at Northwestern was still around, because I think that they'd be so proud that I didn't just lie back down and close my eyes and say, nah, it probably isn't. So I kind of was watching people as they were running in. They were bringing in plasma, and they're bringing in a crash cart, and they're bringing in all sorts of stuff. And stupidly, I'm saying, excuse me, nurse, can I ask you a question? Or, excuse me, sir, can I ask you a question? And they ignored me, of course, and they all rushed into the room, and I'm just lying there saying, it's not possible. It can't be John Lennon. I'm hallucinating. And this guy comes in, and he's a maintenance worker in the hospital. And he's sweeping up in the corner. And I called him over and I said, hey, do you ever watch Channel 7 Eyewitness News? He said, yeah, Geraldo Rivera. I said, yes, that's Channel 7 Eyewitness News. Although he's been gone for a long time. But anyway, could you do me a favor? Here's my card. I gave him a business card. Call this number. Whoever answers the phone, just say, Alan is in Roosevelt Hospital and he thinks he heard that John Lennon may have been shot. Can you do that? He goes, well, I said, here, $20, just one phone call, keep the 20. He goes, okay. So he goes. And I laid back down and thinking I've done my job as a journalist. I don't think an entire minute went by and my eyes are closed because I'm constantly closing my eyes because, again, my head is not in the best place. And lights were causing the headache to be even worse. I hear my name called, Mr. Weiss. And I open my eyes and I look up and there's this security guard and he hands me back my business card. And he says, you can't ask staff to make personal phone calls. And I said, well, technically it's not a personal phone call. It's a professional phone call. I said, can we get away with that? He said, Mr. Weiss, can you just be quiet? We have a situation here and you're causing problems. Just lie here and be quiet, would you please? I said, okay, but is that John Lennon in there? He said, Mr. Weiss, would you just be quiet and lie here? I said, okay. Well, Steve, this is before cell phones. I couldn't just reach in my pocket, pull out a phone, and call the news department. So now I'm feeling that not only am I stupid, because I'm assuming something that in journalism you can't assume, I'm also disrupting the situation somewhat. So that's not why I'm there. I'm not there to make anybody else's life more difficult. And then I hear sobbing. And I'm able to look behind me. Again, I'm lying on the gurney with my head facing the doors that come into the ED. And I look behind me, and there is an Asian woman in a fur coat crying, being brought in on the arm of this very large police officer. I'm a Beatles fan. I've always been a Beatles fan. I lost track of it when John left the Beatles and went with Yoko and started recording. So I knew who she was, but I wasn't so on top of it that I could pick her out of a lineup of similar looking women. Plus, she was looking upside down based upon my orientation. So I thought it was Yoko Ono, but I wasn't positive it was Yoko Ono. But between hearing the name Lennon and seeing what I believe is Yoko Ono, I said, it's just too much to be ignored. And I got to tell you, adrenaline's an amazing thing. My headache went away. The pain in my hip went away. There was a line of gurneys on the wall that led from where I was all the way to the end of the hall. Not that I'm accident prone, but I've been to this hospital before, and I knew that there was a telephone in the waiting room just outside that door. So I get up, and I'm hopping on one foot, and I'm using the gurneys lined up on the wall to help me to get down to the end of the hall. And I literally have my hand on the doorknob, and I could see the phone right through the glass. And I got grabbed on the upper arm here by a vice-like grip of another security guard who says, where are you going? I said, I'm just going to make a phone call. You can't. I said, what do you mean I can't? He says, you can't leave the emergency room. I said, well, you know what? I'm checking myself out. I don't need to be here in the emergency room. I'm leaving. He says, you can't. And he pulls me physically away from the door. And I'm standing there with one foot in the air because my hip was hurting. So I was balanced on one foot. And he says, you got to go back to your bed. And I threatened him. I said, take your hands off me. I am a journalist. I'm going to sue you for assault. I'm going to sue you for violating my First Amendment right. Let go of me. And he just started pulling me towards the bed. And fortune stepped in for a second time. So the first time was the fact that those two officers decided to speak about John Lennon right within my earshot. The second time that fortune stepped in was the officer who brought me in, totally different officer, at that moment appeared. He had been filing a report, and he sees me standing there, and he sees the security guard with his arm on me, and he comes running up to me. He goes, Mr. Weiss, what are you doing standing up? They had to take the stretcher apart to bring you in. And I looked at him, and I've always been told that if you look really deeply in someone's eyes, you can tell if they're lying. So I look really deeply in this police officer's eyes. I said, well, didn't you hear? He said, didn't I hear what? That he's been shot. That who's been shot? I said, John Lennon? And he said, who told you that? And fortunately, at that moment, he took the guard's hand off my arm and waved the guy away. So now I'm just standing with the police officer. And I said, I think I heard, no one told me, but I think I heard two officers talking about that. And he had a mic for his radio on his shoulder, and he pointed to it and he said, Alan, if John Lennon had been shot, it would be on the radio and I'd know about it. So you mean he hasn't been shot? He says, no. Would you please go back to, can I take you back to your gurney? I said, sure. So now I'm hopping back to the gurney on the arm of this police officer, and we're passing the nursing stand. And I truly felt like an idiot that I was making a scene over nothing. And I said to the officer, sir, do me a favor. Can I just call my office? Do you mind? And the phone on the desk of the nursing station is a Centrex phone. You have to have a code to use it. And he knew it, fortunately. He says, sure. So he goes over, punches it in, hands the phone to me, and I get the assignment editor for the 11 o'clock news. The show's not yet on the air. This is probably around 11 o'clock, maybe a little bit left after 11 o'clock.
What time did the show go on the air?
Ordinarily, it would go on at 11, but it was Monday Night Football, and they were going past 11 o'clock in this game, which plays a big role, obviously. So I get the assignment editor on the phone, and I said, hey, it's Alan. And he goes, yeah, we heard about you. You okay? We sent a courier to go pick up your bike from the police. How are you? I said, I'm fine. I know I hit my head, but I think John Lennon may have been shot. And he says, I just heard a call for an ambulance to 72nd Street and Central Park West. Well, anybody who lives in the New York area knows that that is where the Dakota is located. And he said, I was just rolling a crew over there just on the off chance that it could be somebody of note. And I said, well, that's it. I've heard the name. I'm pretty sure I saw Yoko Ono. And now you're telling me that there was a call for an ambulance at 72nd Central Park West. John Lennon is here in the hospital. He's been shot in the chest. He said, all right, I'm rerouting the crew. So hang up the phone. The officer says to me, really? John Lennon's been shot? Oh, yeah, so much for your radio. So he helps me back to my gurney. And I sat on my gurney, and the door was open, and I was able to observe how they were trying to revive him. Well, I sat there and I watched. It was like a semicircle around him of doctors and nurses, and it was incredibly quiet. They were talking like almost in whispers. As I found out later, they didn't know right away that it was John Lennon. That's one of the reasons why it was on the police radio. The police knew who it was when they brought him in, but the doctors weren't told who he was when he was rushed into that room. The doctor that had been working with me, the lady doctor, was one of the doctors, but she was not the main doctor who was handling the efforts to save this man's life. I watched for a good 5 or 6 minutes, and I'll never forget what it looked like seeing an idol of mine, certainly, but possibly next to Muhammad Ali, the single most recognizable human being on the planet, and certainly one of the most beloved human beings on the planet, lying there as these doctors and nurses fought for his life.
So when you phoned in the assignment, where did the word go from there? Did Channel 7 do it locally, or did they pass it on to the network straight away?
As I understand it, they passed it on to the network straight away. Obviously, the producer of the 11 o'clock news started reworking his rundown that was about to go on the air. As soon as the football game was over, he was going to take air. They already had a crew on their way now to the Roosevelt that had been going to the Dakota. I understand that the assignment editor called the ABC network news desk and said to them, at the time, I was the producer of the 6 o'clock Channel 7 Eyewitness News program with the legendary anchor team of Roger Grimsby and Bill Butel. And they called ABC Network and reported what I had reported. But The 11 o'clock news was being delayed because Monday Night Football was on the air. It was the Miami Dolphins and the New England Patriots. And in the booth was Fran Tarkenton, Howard Cosell, and Gifford, who played the key role in this story, actually. So Roone Arledge called and spoke with them and relayed the information that John Lennon had been shot. And Cosell, they got into a commercial and they were talking about it. And Cosell said to the other two, I don't think this is appropriate to announce during a football game. This is a sporting event. This is not the appropriate place to announce it. Cosell had been a journalist. He wasn't just an announcer. He was a sportscaster, and I think he also did regular journalism at some point in his life.
I was going to ask you about that because there is audio of that discussion between him and Gifford that is on YouTube for anybody that wants to hear it. But he didn't sound like a journalist. I think a journalist would have been a little more, he just sounded totally clueless about the whole thing almost. Do you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. Outside of the whole surprise of the entire tragedy, it is one of the main surprises of the night for me was that maybe it was cognitive dissonance. Maybe he just didn't believe it. Maybe even though Roone Arledge had called up, you have to remember, James Brady was pronounced dead on ABC when he really had been shot, when Reagan had been shot. There have been times where newscasters reported wrong information and it destroyed their reputations. Even though they were given good faith information, it just turned out not to be accurate. So Cosell, to my memory, was a lawyer, had been a lawyer. And he was very sharp. Before he worked for ABC Network, he was also a sportscaster on Channel 7 Eyewitness News for quite a while.
Was he?
Yeah, and I didn't work with him there, but having spoken to people who did, they said that he was amazingly smart and would speak without notes perfectly.
That doesn't surprise me a whole lot, given the way he would talk. He didn't need notes.
Yeah, except that when you're doing live TV, the producer tells you just before you're going on, he may have said to you early in the show, you have 3.5 minutes. But since a news show is unrehearsed and things ebb and flow, I was often having to call my sportscaster in the commercial break just before going on, saying, look, we're running heavy. Can you do it in 3 minutes instead of 3.5? Or we're really light. We've lost the story. Can you stretch another minute or two? So that's always happening. And I understood that Cosell, you can give Cosell, I need 2.5 minutes. And this guy on his own had some clock in his head that came in incredibly close to 2.5 minutes on his own. So not only was he talking off the top of his head, he was talking on top of his head within a confined amount of time and hitting it consistently. So he was an impressive person. So I would have to say that maybe he just didn't want to be the person who goes on national television in the middle of a football game and tells the world that one of the greatest idols on the planet has been shot, and then find out later that it was misidentification or whatever.
Cosell did interview Lennon, so that may have had
on Monday Night Football.
That may have had something to do with it. I don't know. I mean, that's not a good reason. Why didn't the producer make the decision rather than the announcers? Why was it left to the announcers?
That's an excellent question. If it were local, the producer would have made the decision. They wear what's called IFB, interrupt feedback broadcast. It's an earpiece that allows them to hear the broadcast, but also the producer can override it and say, wrap up, or throw a commercial, or whatever has to be transmitted. And did that many times to interrupt an anchor or a reporter as they were speaking to give them later information or to correct something they might have said that was incorrect. Yes, that would have been an editorial call from the producer. I think that Arledge went direct, since Arledge was the president of ABC News at the time, he bypassed the producer. Remember, these guys are stars. These guys are the marquee of the ABC network. Remember, ABC was considered the almost broadcasting company or the amateur broadcasting company. And what made ABC is their sports coverage that gave them some traction against NBC and CBS. So Cosell was a star. And clearly, the other two guys were stars. So my guess is that because it came directly from Roone Arledge, to Cosell, they just bypassed the producer just out of efficiency. The fact that Cosell was even considering not doing it, and the producer, who no doubt can hear the audio in the control room, isn't overriding them. Remember, sports producers aren't news producers. They're not used to making news judgment calls. So if you remember the movie September 5th, that tells the story of that horrific event where the Israeli Olympic team in Munich were taken hostage by terrorists and were killed. The movie does an excellent job of bringing you into the control room of the sports producers. And it's very, very clear right from the beginning that these people aren't trained to handle news, especially breaking news. They're trained to handle sports. And therefore, I think that it's no hard leap to make that Roone Arledge didn't want to start dealing with a sports producer who's more interested in making sure that all the tape machines are queued up and playing back the slow-mos and the replays and hitting commercial breaks on time than they are going to make an editorial judgment on whether or not something is newsworthy and worthy of breaking into a national broadcast. So Cosell dragged his feet and said that he just wasn't sure it was the appropriate place. And Frank, no journalist, as far as I know, a fabulous football player with a horrible injury, who then went on to be a fabulous sportscaster, said to him, "You're crazy. You have to tell this. This is news. You have to tell this." And so Cosell grudgingly, if you listen to the recording, grudgingly agrees, comes out of commercial. I think they're in overtime. They may be tied. I mean, you can't pick a more dramatic moment in a football game than the one they're in right there. And a play just ended, and Cosell hasn't said anything. They're back a few seconds. I'm not quite sure how long, but Cosell hasn't said anything. Certainly didn't come back out of commercial saying, "Before we go to the game, I need to tell you something." He comes out, starts talking about the game, and then stops for a moment. And Frank jumps in and says, "Howard, I think we have to tell the people at home what we ourselves know here in the booth." And without missing a beat, Cosell very eloquently says something to the effect of, "Listen, we have to remember that this is a game and just a game, but we do have something to report. We just have learned from ABC News that John Lennon, possibly the most famous Beatle, has been shot." Now, you asked me what happened from the time I called the newsroom to the time Howard announced it on ABC. I was always pretty sure that they weren't going to go on the word of some news producer for local news that they've never met. And there's always been this snobbery between network and local. And if I were them, I wouldn't either. I wouldn't go on one phone call from one person, especially if I don't know that person. So they must have called and somehow or other got collaboration. And the reason why I know that as a fact, even though I never asked anybody about it, is I did not know how many times John had been shot. When Cosell announced it, he said that Lennon had been shot twice, and he also said that Lennon was dead. We need to wind back the clock a little bit because a number of things happened with me to get the word out between the time I called the assignment desk and sat down and watched them trying to save Lennon's life and then the announcement on ABC Network.
Go ahead.
So I was sitting there, and suddenly the doors at both ends of the emergency room opened up, and it seemed like every security guard in the hospital comes running in, and they say, "Lay down." I said, "No, I'm happy sitting here. Lay down." So I laid down on the gurney, and they wheeled me out of the emergency room, and they put me in a room right outside the emergency room, which was very interesting for two reasons. In the emergency room, there's no music. In the hospital, which I was now in, there's music. And I made a note. I called WABC around 11 o'clock, as I told you. About 10 minutes after that, about 11:10, the music on the hospital speakers played the song "All My Lovin'." I had never heard a Beatles song on music in that hospital, but that night at 11:10, was the song All My Lovin'. So the song plays, and I'm digesting that. And I made sure to make note of my watch because it was such an eerie situation to happen. The song ends, and less than a minute after the song ends, I hear a woman's voice scream, "No, no, oh no, oh no." I didn't see it, but I was pretty sure that was Yoko Ono. And shortly after that, they literally put me in a room right outside the doors to the emergency room. The doors open, and there comes out Yoko Ono on the arms of David Geffen, and they leave. Okay, so now I'm sitting in the room. I heard her screaming. I've heard this crazy, eerie situation with the song, and I'm wondering what to do. And my doctor comes back. And she says, "Okay, so let's get back to you." I said, "Whoa, whoa, whoa. What's the story?" She said, "What are you talking about?" I said, "With John Lennon. What's the story with John Lennon?" And she said, "There's going to be a press conference in 30 or 40 minutes. It'll be announced at that point." I said, "Great. What's the story with John Lennon? Is he dead? Is he alive? Were you able to save him? What's the story?" And she says, "I can't tell you." I said, "All right, let me ask you a question. Did you always want to be a doctor?" She said, "Yes." "Did you always want to be a good doctor?" She said, "Yes." "I've always wanted to be a good journalist." Now imagine if you were in medical school and things weren't going so well. You actually were in danger of failing. And you're walking down the street and you see this little 3-year-old toddler walking in the street in front of an oncoming truck. And you run, you pick this kid up, and you save this kid's life. And she looks at me like I'm crazy. And she says, "Where's this going?" I said, "Well, it turns out that kid is the son of the dean of the medical school. What that would do for you to becoming a good doctor is what you telling me what the situation is with John Lennon would do to helping me become a good journalist." And she said, "Good try. I can't tell you anything." I said, "All right, I have another question. Are you in charge of the emergency room?" She said, "Yes." I said, "If a person came in with a gunshot to the chest, would you be required to be with them?" "Yes." "If a person is run with a gunshot to the chest 15 minutes ago, is that something that could be handled so quickly that your presence would no longer be needed?" And she said, "That's an astute observation."
You did not give up.
No, I didn't. I didn't.
That's one of the things that really got me when I first heard your story.
And Steve, I mean, I'm so glad you want to talk about this because, well, for many, many reasons, I've always been afraid that people think that, and it happens. You start telling stories, you start editing it, and you start taking out the parts that you do badly, and you start enhancing the parts that you did well, and you start adding in things that you should have done. Mm-hmm. And I'm always afraid that people are going to say, "You didn't possibly come up with that whole thing about the bus and the truck and failing medical school at the time, right? You didn't really come up with it." Steve, it's true. I did. I don't know where it came from. I think I had plenty of time lying in that gurney by myself to think about what was going on. I was still stunned, as I think the average person would have been upon hearing the news. Anyway, the bottom line is that, yes, it took work and it wasn't over. So I said to her, "Doc, I got to get to that telephone. I just need to make a phone call." And she says, "Alan, you can't. 2 reasons. If I let you up off of this gurney, I could be sued for malpractice. The hospital can sue for malpractice. You can do tremendous damage to yourself. We don't know how badly hurt you are. So it is medically impossible for me to allow you off of this bed to make a phone call." I said, "All right, what's the second reason?" She said, "That's an in-house phone. You need to know the code. And I'm not going to tell you the code." And I looked at her and I said, "Doc, did you always want to be a good doctor?" She said, "Yes." I said, "I always wanted to be a good journalist. You saved that kid and you can help me save my career." I said, "Please." And she looked at me and said, "Look, I have to go and check if radiology is ready for you. So I'm going to leave and I know you're not going to get out of this bed, right? I said, no, I'm not going to get out of the bed. So I'm not going to tell you the code to that phone is 1135. I'll be back in 10 minutes. I said, I'll be here when you get back, doctor. I got up. I hobbled over the phone, punched in the code, whatever it was. I called the newsroom. I spoke to the assignment editor. I told him what I knew. This is before Cosell made the announcement on ABC. And he said he would pass it on to the network. He said, hang on, because ABC Network Radio wants to do an interview with you. And so I waited a few minutes and they switched me over to ABC Network. And I did an interview with them in the hallway, standing on one foot. Fortunately, the doctor didn't come back for a while. When the doctor came back, I was back on the bed. And that was what it was like being in that hospital that night.
Did you ever handle another story in a similar fashion?
I've covered some incredible disasters and situations. Well, one time I followed Senator Sam Ervin into the men's room in the Senate office building when I was a young reporter, radio reporter, trying to get the latest on the Watergate hearings. And actually, as I'm interviewing him, holding my tape recorder, you can hear him in the men's room. And then there was a time I walked into a closed committee hearing by the Armed Services Committee, and I pulled out, and I'm listening to it for about a half hour or so. And when I pulled out my reporter, Senator Talmadge, who was and Sam Nunn, who are my senators from Georgia, recognized me, and there was a huge brouhaha, and I got thrown out of the hearing. But no, you know what esprit escalier means?
No.
Esprit escalier is a legal term. It's French for the spirit of the stairs. What it means is that you're in an argument with somebody, and they throw you down the stairs, and you get up, and you say, you. The words just don't come, and you walk away. And then later on, you say to yourself, oh, I should have said this. I should have said that. We all have that. This time, I didn't. This is the one and only time that I kind of felt like somebody, Jack Williams, my professor at Northwestern, or Dr. Yamashita, my other professor at Northwestern, somebody had their hand on my back saying, you've got this. You don't blow this. Just stay with it. Can you imagine if I had been in that hospital? I assumed that it was nothing important. I got treated and I left. And I found out later that I was lying 7 feet. I mean, my career would have been over. I mean, how could I still have been the producer of the 6 o'clock Eyewitness News after? They don't suffer things like that.
You're back to work. What was the reaction when you got back from not only internally in your office, but maybe up the ladder again? What happened?
Surprisingly, nothing. My dad came and picked me up. I ended up not having anything broken. I ended up just having a very bad contusion on my hip. They gave me a cane, and I walked out into a feeding frenzy. The front door to the emergency room in the old days, it's not there any longer, was enclosed by a large wrought iron fence. And it seemed like every journalist in New York was crowded into that. My crew was there. And so as soon as I came out, Peter Bannon, who was a reporter, saw me and grabbed me and interviewed me right then and there. And then other people stuck their microphones in, interviewed me, yada, yada, yada. I went home. I got up the next day and told ABC, WABC, that I'm coming in. I'm not out on sick leave. I'm producing the 6 o'clock show, which was, back in those days, there was no 5 o'clock show. There was no noon show. There was Nightline the night before. This was the first, in New York, the very first news show beyond the 5-minute cut-in that people would get. And I went and I produced the show, and it is the first show that at least I've ever produced. I produced many shows at Channel 7. The first show that I ever produced that was 90% on one topic. We did what was called team coverage. And my interview was all of a minute, and not even that long, I don't think. I think it was like a 40-second soundbite talking to Peter Bannon, and then all the other stuff. And no one ever said a word to me. Management never ever said a word to me. No one ever said that we should do more than that or we should do a special. Nothing at all. Yoko Ono didn't want to have a funeral. She wanted to have a moment of silence, 10 minutes sound, Central Park. And Channel 7 was going to cover it live. And I said, well, I'm going to produce it. So I came in on that Sunday and produced a 1-hour telecast that was fed out to all the ABC stations. And I've been interviewed by NBC, CBS, BBC, on and on and on. Never interviewed by ABC Network, and only on occasional anniversaries.
I was wondering actually if what you did right after is on YouTube or is around somewhere.
The vigil?
Not the vigil, but the news thing that you put together.
Yeah, I have the newscast. I don't think it's on YouTube. But yeah, I've always been afraid of putting things up on YouTube because I don't want to get in trouble legally for breaking copyright. But I was always hoping somebody else would do it. It was a good newscast. I've gone on record in these interviews saying that we should not be giving the names because that's why he did it. He had a list of people, as you know, that he wanted to target simply so he could become as famous as they were. Anyway, 25-year-old security guard came to New York expressly to do this terrible thing. So many points along the line that could have derailed that terrible thing that unfortunately just didn't happen.
Like I said at the beginning, this isn't really about what happened, but more importantly, it was about getting the story. And I appreciate your taking the time and going through everything. Is there anything that we didn't hit on that maybe as far as getting the story that...
No, I think you got it all. The only thing that I'd like to say is that I'm really glad that you've given me, Steve, this opportunity because there have been some situations where I was misquoted or misrepresented to make it look like I went ahead and told ABC that Lennon was dead when I hadn't gotten confirmation. And that's just absolutely not true. I would never claim to have confirmed something like that without the actual confirmation. So again, for those journalism teachers that have gone to that great newsroom in the sky, I didn't make that mistake.
According to some accounts I've seen, you also felt guilty that you got the word out so quickly because you heard that Yoko wanted to tell Sean, her son, about it first.
That's actually true.
And he told Rolling Stone years later that she did tell him.
Yeah. Well, a reporter that interviewed me, when I told how I've been carrying the guilt for many, many years, at least 20 years after the event, said to me not to worry. He was shown as 5 years old at the time. And this happened at 11. By the time it got on the news, it was 11:20, 11:30, something like that. So illogical for him to have been up watching TV, if you will, at that time. But I guess she was worried that people start calling the house and that things would slip through. So yes, I in no way wanted to add more difficulty to Yoko Ono's life than she was already contending with.
Alan, thank you again for this discussion. It was not an easy story to cover and to do. My best to you. Again, congratulations on your Emmys and my best to you in your work.
Thanks, Steve.
And this week's Beatles News Briefs. First, some chart news. The Beatles Anthology 4 album debuted in the top 10 on several sections of the UK official albums chart, ranking at number 4 on the official albums downloads chart, number 5 on the official album sales and official physical albums charts, number 6 on the official vinyl albums list, and number 9 on the official albums chart itself. Then, the Beatles Anthology collection with all 4 installments of the anthology series debuted at number 7 on both the official album sales and official physical albums charts, number 11 on the official vinyl albums, number 29 on the official albums chart, and number 52 on the official albums downloads. If you have all that and aren't confused, you're better than me. On the U.S. Billboard 200 album chart, Anthology 4 debuted at number 48, while the Anthology collection debuted at number 113. Abbey Road also popped in this week at number 188, marking its 498th appearance on the top 200 albums chart. The Beatles also logged in at number 15 on the most popular artists lists. The BBC announced on December 3rd it has acquired Hamburg Days, a forthcoming 6-part drama series about the Beatles' pre-fame days as a band in the early 1960s. The series is based on the autobiography of Klaus Voormann, who as a young artist along with Astrid Kirchherr met the Beatles in Hamburg before they became famous. Sue Deeks, the BBC's head of scripted pre-buy acquisitions, said in announcing the show that Hamburg Days is the fascinating story of how, in the space of 2 short years, a raw young band from Liverpool honed their music success in Hamburg before returning home to become an overnight success. It is an incredible story, accompanied, of course, by an amazing soundtrack. No word on whether the Beatles have authorized the soundtrack for this. The film is a WNB Television and Turbine Studios production for the ZDF, the BBC, and AGC Television.
One of the consultants on the show is our old buddy Alan Kozin, who, as many of you know, spent a long time at the New York Times as their unofficial Beatle reporter and is now co-host on the Things We Said Today podcast. Nice going, Alan. There's been no word on when the series will be released.
And here's some news on another Beatles film project. Leanne Best, the niece of Beatles original drummer Pete Best, will play John Lennon's Aunt Mimi in Sam Mendes' upcoming quartet of Beatles solo film biographies due for release in 2028. Also recently cast are Jim Morrissey as Jim McCartney, Paul's father, and Bobby Schofield as Beatles road manager Neil Aspinall.
Thanks very much for listening to our podcast today. If you enjoyed our program, we'd really appreciate a positive review at the place where you get your podcasts. Apple and Google love positive reviews, and it really helps us. If you don't already, please subscribe to our show so you'll get our newest shows right away. We have some great shows coming up. We would love to hear your suggestions for the show, so please write to us at BeatlesNewsBriefs@gmail.com or catch us online on Facebook in our Beatles News and Information group. If you've missed any of our past shows, you can hear them at marinucci.podbean.com. And please tell your friends about us. We appreciate you all for listening. Now here again is Steve Marinucci.
Well, that's it for this time around. Thanks for listening, and thanks for being here. We appreciate you for not only for listening to this show, but listening to all our shows this year. Our numbers are going up, and we really appreciate it. So a big happy holidays to you all, and we'll see you on our next show. Take care.
Be seeing you.